During the Middle Ages, few images inspired as much terror as the sight of a condemned person lying on the ground, surrounded by magistrates, soldiers, and onlookers, while the executioner raised a spiked wheel. This instrument, which was not originally designed to kill, eventually became one of the most feared execution devices in Europe. The so-called breaking wheel became a symbol of the punitive power of kings, princes, and urban courts, used not only to physically eliminate the criminal but also to morally destroy what they represented. The mechanics of the torture began long before the first blow. The condemned was led to the scaffold after a public reading of their sentence, which presented the crimes in a ritualistic tone meant to underline the legitimacy of the punishment. Executioners laid out the body, sometimes tied to a wooden cross or simply to stakes driven into the ground. The wheel, an everyday object, was transformed into a symbol of dislocation. Limbs were methodically struck, starting with the arms and then the legs, always from the extremities toward the torso, to fracture each bone without causing immediate death. Judicial records from the Holy Roman Empire describe this procedure in detail. The Zerbrechen, or breaking, followed a precise order: 2 blows on the upper part of each arm, 2 on the lower, 2 on the thighs, and 2 on the calves. The goal was not to end life, but to turn the condemned into a broken body incapable of supporting itself. Shattered bones created an unrecognizable anatomy, and limbs twisted at grotesque angles, while spectators often considered the act a legitimate form of justice. After the initial breaking, the body was elevated to be placed on the wheel itself, secured between the spokes or woven through them according to local custom. In some territories, such as France and certain German regions, the wheel was mounted on a post, exposing the condemned to public view. There, between heaven and earth, they could remain alive for hours or even days. Chronicles recount extreme cases in which a condemned person survived more than 36 hours, sustained only by instinct and shallow breathing, while the public gathered to watch their agony. In some variations of the punishment, death was not the immediate goal but prolonged suffering. The display on the wheel served as a permanent warning, a reminder for those who might challenge the law or the authority of the prince. By placing the wheel at transit points, political power sought to let those sun- and wind-burned bones narrate the story of the crime and its punishment better than any proclamation. The wheel was not applied to all criminals. It was reserved for particularly heinous crimes: aggravated murders, violent robberies, crimes against nobility, or cases where the condemned was considered to have disrupted social order harmfully. In medieval legal thought, the more unnatural the crime, the more denaturalized the offender's body should be. Medieval justice did not only seek to eliminate the offender, but also to visually reaffirm the order of the world. Some kingdoms introduced additional variations. In Scandinavia, for example, there was the practice of starting the breaking with the legs so that the suffering was prolonged without causing rapid death from shock or blood loss. Meanwhile, in northern regions of Italy, the custom of placing wooden wedges between the joints before the blows is documented, increasing the fracture and bursting of tissues. Each local interpretation added nuances to the same message. The transgression had to be punished with a spectacle that marked the community. This exemplary character was reinforced by the participation of the public. The execution was a ceremony involving the population, not just as spectators, but as legitimizers of the imposed order. The cries, reactions, and silences of the crowd became an integral part of the judicial process. In heavily populated cities, the crowd could exceed 2,000 people, attracted by morbid curiosity, a sense of justice, or the desire to witness the punishment of a common enemy. Occasionally, drinks were offered, and there are records of cases where street vendors took advantage of the gathering to set up around the scaffold. Over time, some executioners developed a certain professional reputation. They were expected to have technical precision, anatomical knowledge, and an almost surgical ability to inflict pain without causing immediate death. Executioners' manuals from the 13th and 14th centuries indicate how to distribute the weight of the wheel, how to calculate the force of the blow, and how to avoid prematurely breaking the torso. These specialists could be well paid and sometimes traveled from city to city to apply methods considered too complex for inexperienced hands. Even so, breaking on the wheel was not an immutable torment. On rare occasions, and especially in cases where there was popular compassion for the condemned, the executioner could hasten death with a final blow to the chest, the so-called coup de grâce. This gesture, although exceptional, shows that even within medieval brutality there was room for subjective interpretations of justice and suffering. Towards the end of the Middle Ages, the wheel began to coexist with other faster or more symbolic methods, but its power as an image of terror did not diminish. The impalement. Impaling was one of the most feared and humiliating methods of execution in the Middle Ages, although its roots go back to much older civilizations. By the time medieval Europe adopted it, the practice had evolved from a punishment of war and political submission into a form of institutionalized terror. Essentially, it consisted of inserting a stake or pike through the body of the condemned, usually via the anus or vagina, and letting it exit through the torso, shoulders, or mouth without immediately damaging vital organs. Death could take hours or even days, becoming a macabre spectacle that conveyed a clear message. Authority had absolute power over the body and human dignity. Although it is mostly associated with some rulers of Eastern Europe, impalement had already been used by Mesopotamian civilizations, where kings such as Assyria applied this punishment en masse against rebellious cities. Assyrian reliefs show rows of bodies pierced by stakes placed in front of conquered walls, a way of warning that disobedience brought not only death but total loss of honor. In Persia, according to classical authors such as Herodotus, it was also a torment reserved for serious crimes against the state. This ancient background reveals that impalement did not arise as an impulsive or improvised method, but as part of calculated strategies of domination. In medieval Europe, impalement acquired its own nuances. Some regions of the Holy Roman Empire used it occasionally, especially against particularly cruel murderers or repeat bandits. In Slavic territories, especially in Poland and Bohemia, cases are recorded in judicial manuscripts from the 14th and 15th centuries, where the careful insertion of the stake was described to prolong the condemned's agony. The idea was not only to eliminate the criminal, but to display them and keep them alive as long as possible, setting a precedent for those who dared to challenge the feudal lord. The process required remarkable technical mastery. The stake had to be well polished and slightly greased to facilitate penetration without causing immediate lethal tears. The executioner placed it on the ground in a slanted position so that the weight of the condemned's own body would slowly push it inward. If the impalement was performed in public, the crowd could watch as the prisoner, unable to move, was slowly elevated as the stake was driven into the ground and held him upright. Death occurred from internal bleeding, shock, or organ collapse, but was rarely instantaneous. The political symbolism of impalement reached its peak in Eastern Europe, particularly in the principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania. Chronicles of the time recount how Vlad III, known as Draculaea or Vlad the Impaler, turned this torment into the backbone of his governing strategy during the 15th century. By placing thousands of impaled bodies along roads and city entrances, Vlad built an architecture of fear that discouraged revolts, Ottoman invasions, and internal betrayals. Although the numbers were probably exaggerated by hostile chroniclers, the descriptions agree that impalement was used with unusual regularity compared to other Christian territories. But Vlad was not the only one to use this punishment systematically. In the Ottoman Empire, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries, impalement was applied as a public execution to punish desertions, rebellions, or crimes considered particularly dishonorable. Its use was intended to demonstrate that even the body of the most insignificant individual could be transformed into a symbol of imperial authority. Executions were carried out in squares, markets, or at the gates of fortresses, where the upright body of the impaled acted as a living post reminding people of the order imposed by the Sultan. In some cases, impalement had regional variations. In certain areas of Eastern Europe, the stake was inserted through the abdomen, allowing the condemned to die more quickly. In others, blunt stakes were used that did not pierce vital organs quickly, thus prolonging the torment. Sources also mention horizontal impalements, where the condemned was fixed to a beam passed through the body, although this variant was less common. Despite these differences, the common denominator was always the intention to cause extreme suffering and total dehumanization. Executions by impalement were usually accompanied by a prior judicial ceremony, although in border areas or during periods of war they could be applied without formal trial. The presence of spectators was essential. The authority needed the pain to become a story, for the punishment to travel through collective memory as much as through sight. The public square thus became a stage where brutality functioned as a tool of governance. One aspect that distinguishes impalement from other medieval methods is its psychological dimension. The torment turned the condemned's body into a penetrated, violated, and exposed object, thereby violating social norms regarding modesty and dignity. This deeply humiliating nature made it especially feared among warriors, nobles, and peasants alike. Dying impaled not only meant suffering but also losing forever control over one's own image and memory. The bonfire. In the Middle Ages, few images condensed as much symbolic power as the pyre. Fire, in its spiritual and punitive dimension, became the instrument par excellence for punishing what was considered a threat to faith, social order, and ecclesiastical authority. Although it was used for a variety of crimes, its most remembered association is the persecution of heresy, a crime that mixed theology, politics, and collective fear. Dying at the stake meant not only the physical destruction of the body, but also its purification according to the theological logic of the time. Fire eliminated the doctrinal corruption that the heretic had introduced into the Christian community. The act began with the ceremony of degradation of the condemned, especially if they were a cleric. They were stripped of their sacred garments in a ritual process that emphasized the severity of their doctrinal deviation. Then the captive was handed over to civil authorities with the formula, "The Church does not shed blood," a phrase that appeared innocent while delegating the final act to secular justice. In reality, fire was the tool that both spheres, religious and civil, used to project a message of unity and control. The construction of the pyre was a precise procedure. A central post was built, to which the condemned was tied with ropes or chains, and around it logs, branches, and flammable material were piled. In high public impact executions, tar, resin, or straw was added to accelerate combustion. The height of the pile depended on the purpose. A low pyre allowed a slower death by smoke inhalation. A tall pyre produced rapid combustion visible even to those far from the scaffold. Unlike other methods of execution, the pyre usually attracted huge crowds. Entire cities gathered in squares, markets, or open areas to watch the punishment of the heretic. Town criers announced the date and time in advance, creating anticipation that turned the act into a public liturgy. In many cases, the execution was accompanied by sermons or readings of doctrinal texts intended to reinforce orthodoxy in the audience. The pyre was an educational spectacle, a reminder that straying from faith not only endangered the soul's salvation but also the stability of the community. History is full of examples illustrating the political power of fire. In 1314, Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Templars, was burned alive in Paris after a trial full of contradictions. His death symbolized the combined power of King Philip IV of France and the papacy to eliminate an order that had accumulated too much prestige. In 1431, Joan of Arc was executed in Rouen on charges of heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing. Her pyre not only sought to destroy the woman who had inspired French troops, but also to erase the challenge her figure posed to English authority. The Inquisition, both in its medieval and later variants, resorted to the pyre as the final punishment after long investigations. In particular, the Spanish Inquisition made famous the use of the auto da fe, a ceremony that included the public reading of sentences and the delivery of the condemned. Although most inquisitorial trials did not end in executions, the pyres that did occur had a disproportionate impact on collective memory. The idea that the flame purified the guilty and protected society from their ideas was a pillar in legitimizing punishment. Fire was also used against those who practiced activities considered dangerous to moral or spiritual order, such as witchcraft. In Germanic and Scandinavian regions, especially during the 15th and 16th centuries, witch hunts reached levels of collective paranoia that led thousands of women and some men to the pyre. It was believed that fire prevented the condemned from returning from beyond, or that their body could be used by evil forces. Execution by fire became an act that combined superstition, theology, and fear. The process of dying at the stake varied according to the intensity of the fire and the structure of the pyre. In the best case, the condemned lost consciousness in a few minutes from smoke inhalation. In other cases, especially when the pyre was poorly constructed, death could take tens of minutes or even hours as the flames slowly consumed the flesh. Urban chronicles recount moments when executioners had to stoke the pyre to accelerate the process. In certain territories, a merciful act was allowed, strangling the condemned before the fire reached them. However, this gesture was not always applied, as the sight of the victim writhing in the pyre reinforced the deterrent effect of the torment. The pyre also had an important legal component. It erased the body. Unlike beheading or hanging, which left physical remains susceptible to becoming relics or symbols of resistance, fire reduced everything to ashes. This detail was not minor in a world where bodily remains, even of heretics, could acquire political or spiritual value for certain groups. The pyre nullified any possibility of cult, claim, or physical memory of the executed. The dismemberment. Dismemberment was one of the most drastic and symbolic punishments of the Middle Ages, a form of execution intended not only to physically eliminate the guilty party, but also to amplify the impact of their death through the literal fragmentation of the body. The division of the prisoner into multiple parts appeared in European legal codes from early centuries, but reached its greatest notoriety between the 12th and 15th centuries, when it became a method reserved for crimes considered a direct affront to political power. Treason, regicide, serious conspiracies, particularly cruel murders, or acts that threatened the stability of the lordship or kingdom. Dividing the body was symbolically dividing the threat, and dispersing the remains meant erasing their memory. There are two main documented methods in the Middle Ages. The first was dismemberment by dragging and cutting with sharp weapons. The second, much more extreme, used the driving force of animals to separate the limbs simultaneously. Both versions had a carefully structured ceremonial character, designed to reinforce the authority of the one issuing the sentence. In the more common variant, the condemned was first executed by strangulation, decapitation, or partial hanging, a key point that varied depending on the court's intent. If the crime was considered particularly serious, the prisoner was dismembered alive, although this practice was more exceptional due to its technical complexity and the risk that death would occur too quickly, eliminating the expected public effect. In most cases, prior death ensured that dismemberment was a subsequent, almost ritual act meant to send a message to those observing or hearing about the execution. The executioner used heavy axes or long knives to separate the limbs at the joints. Strength and precision were required, as human bones are not easy to cut in a single blow, especially when the body had already begun the process of rigor mortis. In cities experienced in this type of sentence, special wooden blocks and reinforced tools were used to speed up the process. Once the arms and legs were cut, the parts were placed on tables or in baskets for subsequent display. The head, especially in cases of treason, was mounted on pikes and placed in strategic locations, walls, bridges, or main squares. The second method, dismemberment by horses, originated in Central Europe and France, although cases were also recorded in England and some Slavic territories. In this procedure, 4 horses were tied to the condemned person's limbs, opposite ends pointing in different directions. The animals were simultaneously encouraged to run, tightening the ropes until the body yielded. However, sources indicate that the process rarely worked immediately. The natural resistance of human tendons forced the executioner to intervene to partially cut the joints before the horses completed the separation. One of the most documented cases occurred in 1757, when the French regicide Robert François Damiens was sentenced to a public dismemberment in Paris. Although this example belongs to the pre-modern period, its procedure reflects practices that had been applied for centuries. After subjecting him to preliminary tortures, horses pulled at his limbs without achieving immediate separation, forcing the executioners to use knives to facilitate the dismemberment. The execution was witnessed by thousands of people, demonstrating that even in a period closer to modern times, the exemplary nature of dismemberment remained a political tool. The purpose of dismemberment did not end with the execution. Each amputated limb had a specific destination. It was hung on main roads, rural crosses, or city entrances. In more centralized kingdoms, the remains could be sent to different regions to warn vassals and subjects about the consequences of disobedience. This dispersion also prevented the creation of a place of worship or gathering around the executed body. a frequent concern in cases of popular rebels or charismatic figures. The role of the public was fundamental. The execution had to be visible, understandable, and memorable. In large cities, the announcement was made days in advance, and the spectacle gathered a crowd that interpreted the act as a political lesson. Food and drinks were often sold around the scaffold, turning death into an ambiguous space where solemnity and leisure mixed. Sensory impact, such as the sound of breaking bones, the smell of blood, the screams, or the expectant silence, reinforced the pedagogical nature of the punishment. In England, dismemberment took a particularly elaborate form known as hanged, drawn, and quartered. The accused was first dragged to the place of execution, then hanged without dying, afterwards eviscerated and finally dismembered. Although this practice is associated with the Tudor and Stuart period, its medieval roots are evident, fragmenting the body to symbolically fragment the threat. Dismemberment was also used against notorious bandits and violent criminals, although its application was usually more selective. In regions of Germany and the Netherlands, some bandits were first executed on the wheel and then dismembered for display. In Italy, certain cities employed it during internal conflicts as a way to eliminate political conspirators. Judicial drowning. Judicial drowning was one of the most widespread execution methods of the Middle Ages, both for its apparent simplicity and for the moral weight it carried. Unlike other tortures that sought a bloody spectacle, drowning was perceived as a silent, clean punishment and, in certain territories, even appropriate for specific social groups or crimes considered especially dishonorable. Although its execution could vary significantly depending on the region, its essence remained constant, depriving the condemned of air and allowing water, a symbol of purity and the boundary between life and death, to act as the final judge. The oldest form of judicial drowning consisted simply of immersing the condemned in a river, lake, or well until they stopped breathing. In early times, this practice was associated with communal punishments. In certain Germanic peoples, for example, women accused of adultery or infanticide were tied and submerged in deep waters as part of a ritual act sanctioned by the community. The execution took place before the eyes of family members, neighbors, and local authorities, turning drowning into a penalty that reinforced social norms related to honor and sexual morality. With the development of medieval courts, drowning began to be applied with greater formality. In cities of the Holy Roman Empire, such as Nuremberg or Augsburg, cases are documented in which the condemned was placed inside a large wooden tub filled with water, known in some sources as a schart. This tub was used both for executions and for prior physical punishments, allowing executioners to exercise more precise control over the process. Sometimes weights were added to the prisoner's body to accelerate immersion, although in public executions a slower process was preferred, allowing spectators to observe the desperate struggle to keep the head above water. Another variant existed in English law, where there was a punishment called the drowning pit, applied mainly to women convicted of crimes that in men would merit hanging. This differentiation did not imply leniency. On the contrary, it reflected the moral logic of the time, according to which publicly exposing the female body hanging from a rope could be considered indecorous. Water, due to its progressive invisibility, seemed to preserve a certain decency. Judicial sources show that this distinction endured for centuries, and even when hanging became an almost universal punishment, drowning remained for certain cases. In some regions of Scotland and the Netherlands, there existed a particularly cruel variant, bulging or bulging punishment. The condemned was placed in a leather or canvas sack along with symbolic objects and then thrown into a river or canal. This practice combined public humiliation with a slow, claustrophobic death. Unable to move arms or legs, the condemned experienced asphyxiation in a more desperate way. In certain Dutch accounts, witnesses describe how the sacks could take interminable minutes to sink completely, while the crowd observed the hidden agony inside. An additional variant appears in documents from northern Italy, where dukes and communal authorities applied drowning to punish monetary frauds and crimes against public administration. In Venice, for example, some accused were thrown into the lagoon tied to a weight. Other times they were repeatedly submerged until resistance ceased. The choice of water had a double meaning. As a city surrounded by canals, Venice used its own landscape to reinforce the idea that betrayal of the political order dissolved there, under the waters that sustained urban life. In many rural areas of Central Europe, drowning was also associated with the water test, an ancient judicial procedure in which innocence or guilt was expected to be revealed by the accused's behavior when thrown into a pond or river. Although technically different from execution by drowning, this ordeal became a scene where water acquired a divine role. If the accused floated, they were considered guilty, as the water created by God rejected the sinner. If they sank, it meant innocence, although the risk of death was almost inevitable. Occasionally, when the ordeal resulted in floating, the condemned was immediately executed by drowning, generating a circle of fatality difficult to avoid. Despite its apparent simplicity, judicial drowning was not free from theatricality. In riverside cities of France and the Kingdom of Aragon, executions took place on main bridges to ensure visibility. Executioners tied the condemned with ropes around the torso and legs, then slowly lowered them into the water. The condemned's instinctive struggle became part of the spectacle. Sometimes family members were allowed to approach the shore to witness the process, reinforcing the idea that justice had to be not only seen but felt emotionally. Records indicate that drowning could also be considered a penalty of social equalization. In certain Germanic cities, it was applied to nobles who had committed especially disgraceful crimes, as hanging was perceived as a more humiliating punishment reserved for plebeians and bandits. Immersing a noble in deep water without spilling blood allowed justice to be carried out without staining the honor of the aristocratic caste. The torment of the cradle, or Judas cradle. Among the most perverse and meticulously designed instruments of the Middle Ages was the Judas cradle, also known as the pyramidal rack. Unlike other execution methods intended to quickly end the condemned's life, the Judas cradle had a different function. It was a pre-torture tool used to break the will, extract confessions, or punish crimes considered particularly immoral. Although it did not always result in death, its systematic use caused infections, internal tears, and, in many cases, a slow and atrocious end. Its mere mention in judicial records generated fear and submission. The design was as simple as it was brutal. It consisted of a wooden structure, usually a tall bench with a square-based pyramid on top. The tip of the pyramid, sharp and polished, was oriented upwards. The prisoner, completely naked, was placed on it so that the vertex penetrated their anal or vaginal cavity. The body's position was controlled using ropes or pulleys. The condemned's legs were stretched downward and to the sides, gradually increasing the pressure on the contact area. The body's weight did the rest. Often, to intensify the torment, weights were added to the ankles or intermittent pulls were applied. The pyramid's tip was not designed to kill immediately, but to slowly tear muscles, tissues, and cause internal injuries that would eventually become infected. The pain was acute and sustained, lasting hours or even days, depending on the tortured person's physical endurance and the purpose of the punishment. Although there is no exact date for the emergence of this instrument, sources place it between the 13th and 14th centuries in northern Italy and the Holy Roman Empire. It was used by civil tribunals, local courts, and later by ecclesiastical bodies during trials for heresy, blasphemy, sodomy, and other crimes considered offenses against Christian morality. The Judas cradle was a portable device, allowing its installation in basements, prisons, secret chambers, or even open spaces if the intent was to publicly display the torture. In inquisitorial records from Carcassonne and Toulouse during the 14th century, there are explicit mentions of the use of this technique. Scribes coldly recorded the number of sessions, the duration of each, and the accused's reaction. In some cases, a brief rest was allowed before placing the prisoner back on the pyramid. The cruelty lay not only in the design of the object, but also in its systematic use as a mechanism of physical and psychological wear. Unlike other medieval methods that required public infrastructure, the Judas cradle operated in the shadows. Its goal was not to display punishment, but to provoke silent submission. It was the instrument of prolonged interrogations, secrets extracted in whispers, confessions obtained after long nights of crying and torment. In this context, torture was not the final punishment, but a means to achieve execution or forced repentance. The use of the Judas cradle also reveals a gendered logic in punishment. Women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or improper behavior were placed on the pyramid as a form of sexualized punishment. The goal was not only to inflict pain, but to humiliate, symbolically decompose their bodies considered a source of sin. In many cases, the result was a slow death from septicemia, internal hemorrhages, or general organ collapse, although official records rarely attributed the death directly to the torment itself. During the 15th and 16th centuries, with the expansion of the Inquisition and the refinement of interrogation methods, the Judas cradle remained a common tool. Although little was said about it publicly, its reputation spread in prisons, towns, and among prisoners who feared interrogation for crimes of faith. Some contemporary treatises justified its use with theological arguments. Pain reflected the suffering of the soul that needed purification. For others, such as certain Italian jurists, the torment was simply a way to guarantee state security. Sometimes the punishment did not end with torture. If the prisoner did not die on the pyramid, they could later be executed by another method: hanging, burning, or decapitation, depending on the crime and the authority issuing the sentence. In such cases, prior suffering was not considered excessive, but a preparation of body and spirit for final punishment. Dying after days of agony on the Judas cradle was, in many ways, a way to erase any trace of defiance against religious or civil authority. In certain manuscripts, there are even cases where the prisoner, already physically and mentally destroyed, begged to be executed immediately as a form of redemption. The primitive guillotine. Although the guillotine is almost exclusively associated with revolutionary France in the 18th century, its origins go back much further to the Middle Ages, when various European regions developed rudimentary devices designed to achieve a quick, controlled, and, compared to other methods, surprisingly efficient decapitation. Far from being a sudden innovation, the guillotine was the culmination of centuries of mechanical experimentation applied to capital punishment, an effort intended to reduce executioner errors, make the execution cleaner, and at the same time reinforce the public nature of the ordeal. The clearest precedents come from England and Scotland. One of the earliest documented devices was the Halifax gibbet, used from the late 13th century. It was a wooden tower frame with a heavy blade that was raised using ropes and then dropped by the force of gravity. The victim was placed with the neck between two slats, and when the mechanism was released, it quickly descended to sever it. Although rudimentary, the Halifax gibbet already displayed the essential logic of the device, replacing human strength with mechanical precision. In Scotland, a device known as the maiden had an even longer use. Introduced in the mid-16th century, although based on earlier techniques, it consisted of a mobile structure that allowed it to be transported to different parts of Edinburgh for public executions. The triangular blade was guided by two side grooves that ensured a straight and stable fall. The Scottish population knew it for decades, and it became part of urban iconography, appearing in chronicles and pamphlets. Although its fame partly belongs to the Renaissance, its design reflects the medieval continuity of tools aimed at improving decapitation. However, the true medieval root lies in even older structures described in 13th century French and Italian documents. In Provence and some northern Italian cities, mechanisms called mannaja or mannaia were used, consisting of large axes mounted on elevated supports. The executioner released the blade from a certain height so that it would fall with greater speed and precision. Sometimes the blade was so heavy that several assistants were needed to lift it, showing the transition from a simple hand axe to a semi-mechanical device. The common purpose of these artifacts was to solve a recurring problem. Manual decapitation was not always effective. The executioner, due to insufficient skill or nervousness in front of the public, could fail on the first strike, forcing the maneuver to be repeated amid screams and tension that affected the dignity of the condemned and the solemnity of the act. In a judicial system where execution was a spectacle full of symbolism, mistakes undermined authority. The primitive guillotine thus emerged as an attempt to reduce the human margin in an act that had to be flawless. The use of these mechanisms also responded to the social status of the executed. Decapitation was considered a noble way to die, reserved for members of the aristocracy, high-ranking clergy, or criminals whose social status required a more respectable end than hanging or the wheel. Offering a quick and precise death was seen as a privilege that distinguished the executed from common criminals. In this sense, the medieval guillotine was an instrument that reinforced hierarchies, not one that eliminated them. However, the operation of these devices was not always as clean as expected. Chronicles record cases where the blade did not fall with enough force or got stuck in the grooves, forcing the executioners to complete the decapitation manually. In Scotland, some accounts mention that the maiden, despite its overall effectiveness, could require adjustments between executions to avoid failures. Mechanical precision, although superior to the traditional axe, still depended on the craftsmanship quality of the device. These mechanisms were mainly used in public executions, where the spectacle had to be visible from afar. The scaffold was raised and the device placed at its highest point to allow the crowd to observe the blade's fall. Occasionally, the executioner would verbally announce the exact moment he would release the rope to prepare the audience. The fall could be accompanied by applause, screams, or tense silence, depending on the notoriety of the condemned. The devices also had an educational role. Unlike prolonged torture, quick decapitation demonstrated the state's or the feudal lord's ability to administer justice in an orderly manner. It was an execution without prolonged suffering, but not devoid of theatricality. The shining blade, the dry sound of impact, and the body collapsing created an image that remained in the memory of those witnessing the ordeal. In some German territories, the mechanism was even used by itinerant executioners who transported the dismantled structure from city to city. This mobility suggests there was a recurring demand for executions that required precision, and that authorities considered the primitive guillotine a reliable method. By the late Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, the idea of a decapitating machine was already deeply rooted in the European imagination. When Joseph Ignace Guillotin proposed in 1789 a contraption to guarantee quick and equal decapitations, he was not inventing a new principle but systematizing a long tradition. His proposal merely perfected the concept that had been functioning in Europe for centuries: the hot iron chamber. Among the most feared methods of torture in the Middle Ages, few reached the sinister reputation of the hot iron chambers, spaces designed to inflict progressive burns, mutilations, and prolonged agony preceding death. Although their forms varied by region, they all shared the same principle: to enclose the condemned in an environment of extreme heat generated by braziers, metal plates, or walls exposed to fire. This ordeal combined claustrophobic confinement with direct physical suffering, creating a total punishment where the victim could escape neither the metal nor themselves. The origin of these chambers is not easy to trace. Some antecedents can be found in late Roman practices and Byzantine tortures, but it was in medieval Europe that the device took on a systematic form. In castles, fortresses, and judicial headquarters, small rooms were built with walls lined with metal or thick stone, prepared to withstand high temperatures without collapsing. They were often known as burning chambers, red rooms, or judgment ovens, depending on the local language and the intended purpose. The operation was deliberate. Braziers were prepared outside or beneath the floor, slowly heating the metal walls until they became incandescent surfaces. In some cases, iron blocks were preheated in furnaces and then introduced into the chamber. The condemned, naked or half-naked, was pushed into the confined space. Once the door was closed, the real torture began. The heat attacked not only the skin but also the lungs. Breathing air rising rapidly above 60 or 70 degrees caused gradual suffocation, mixed with the intense pain of burns. Judicial records from certain Germanic regions mention chambers where red-hot iron bars were hung from the ceiling, forcing the prisoner to move constantly in a futile attempt to avoid contact. This movement, in turn, accelerated muscular exhaustion and the inhalation of hot air. The chamber did not produce immediate death. It was built so the victim could live long enough to experience every phase of the torment. In Italian territories, especially in some northern city-states, hot iron chambers were used as part of prolonged interrogations. The accused could be placed in them for short periods as a warning, removed to continue the interrogation, and then returned if their testimony was deemed insufficient. Thermal torture allowed a dosing of pain difficult to achieve with other instruments. The goal was clear: to break the will before breaking the body. In some contexts, these chambers were combined with additional methods. For example, stocks were placed on the limbs to immobilize the prisoner in specific positions, forcing them to remain close to the burning walls. In certain 14th century French castles, chains fixed to the ceiling were used to partially suspend the condemned so they could not fully support themselves on the ground. Every gesture, every breath, every attempt to move became a new burn. Another method involved applying hot iron plates directly onto the skin while the prisoner was locked in the chamber. Executioners, protected by thick gloves, opened the door for brief moments to insert the scorching plates, immediately closing it to retain the heat. These plates caused deep burns that destroyed not only the skin but also the flesh and nerves, generating indescribable suffering. If the chamber was sufficiently airtight, the air inside lost oxygen rapidly, creating a dense environment in which suffocation competed with burns to cause death. The victim could lose consciousness before the flames or burning walls completely consumed their body, but in most cases the agony was prolonged. Depending on the intensity of the heat, death could take between 15 minutes and several hours. The symbolism of this method was intense. Fire had always been a purifying element in the medieval mindset, but in the hot iron chamber, it became a means of suffering more intimate and controlled than the public stake. While the stake exposed the punishment before the eyes of the crowd, the chamber concealed it in a confined space reserved for crimes considered especially serious: treason, conspiracy, severe heresy, or attacks against political figures. Execution could be public or private, but its reputation traveled by word of mouth, instilling fear without the need for open spectacles. Central European castles preserved records of these chambers until the 16th century, when faster or more standardized methods began to replace them. The vertical saw. The vertical saw was one of the most disturbing and cruel tortures of the Middle Ages, a form of execution designed not only to kill, but to prolong the condemned's agony and expose them as an extreme warning to the community. Its brutality lay in the method itself. The prisoner's body was suspended face down, legs spread, while two executioners manipulated a long saw to slowly divide the body from the groin up to the torso. Although its use was not as widespread as the stake or the gallows, its sinister reputation was enough to turn it into a living legend of medieval torture. The mechanics were simple, but the effect was devastating. First, the condemned was forced to undress, or their lower garments were removed to allow direct access. Then they were hung by the feet, usually from a beam or a wooden structure prepared for this purpose. This inverted position was not accidental. It caused blood to concentrate in the head and chest, keeping the executed conscious for longer. As the heart pumped forcefully upward, the brain received enough oxygen to prevent early fainting. The condemned was thus forced to experience each phase of torment fully conscious. Once suspended, the execution began. The executioners used a long two-handled saw, similar to those used to cut thick logs. The first cut was made between the legs, where soft flesh allowed rapid progress. However, as the blade rose toward the pelvis, the process slowed due to denser bones. The work required strength, coordination, and endurance. The saw had to advance with slow, steady movements to avoid getting stuck in the tissues. Medieval chronicles state that the condemned could remain alive until the saw reached the abdomen, and even higher, depending on their physical strength and the executioner's pace. The inverted position maintained blood flow to the upper body during much of the execution, prolonging the agony. This made the vertical saw an especially cruel method, capable of keeping the prisoner conscious while watching, from their inverted perspective, the rhythmic movement of the saw gradually cutting them apart. Although the vertical saw appears in accounts from various European territories, the most detailed records come from Alpine regions, certain German courts, and rural areas of France and Bohemia. There are also references to its use in Spain for punishing particularly infamous crimes, though with less documentary regularity than in Central Europe. Often the saw was reserved for crimes that deeply affected the moral order: parricide, domestic treason, premeditated murder with cruelty, or acts considered by authorities as offenses against nature. In some contexts, the vertical saw was applied as an exemplary punishment during periods of political or religious instability. In certain local wars, feudal lords and military leaders used this method to terrorize rebellious populations or punish spies and deserters. Executions were usually carried out in public squares, markets, or even crossroads, places where visibility was maximum. Crowds gathered around the scaffold, witnessing a spectacle combining horror, morbid curiosity, and the sense of observing an act that, according to the logic of the time, was meant to protect social order. Judicial sources describe variations of the ordeal. In some cases, the execution did not aim to complete the total partition of the body. It was enough to reach a certain height to cause death by shock, massive blood loss, or organ collapse. In other cases, especially in rural areas where judicial control was more fragmented, executioners or armed men completed the division of the body as a symbolic act accompanying the sentence. The goal was not only to kill, but to dramatize in an extreme way the destruction of the transgressor. An added element of the ordeal was the psychological impact on observers. The inverted body, the movement of the saw, and the torrent of blood falling to the ground created a scene that imprinted in memory the message of authority. Certain crimes not only deserved death, but a death that left an indelible mark on the community. The vertical saw, due to its explicit brutality, produced an effect that transcended the moment of execution and was transmitted as a warning for generations. Medieval literature also contributed to the method's notoriety. Certain chronicles exaggerated the cruelty of the vertical saw to emphasize the severity of a punishment or the barbarity of a specific ruler. Although some accounts contain hyperbolized elements, the existence of the ordeal is confirmed by multiple judicial sources, municipal records, and notarial documents. Its actual use, though not every day, was frequent enough to be recorded in several European cities. Crushing by stones or planks. Crushing as a method of execution developed in the Middle Ages from much older practices but acquired its own forms depending on the region and type of crime. Essentially, it consisted of subjecting the condemned person's body to the increasing weight of stones, beams, or planks until asphyxiation, bone breakage, or organ collapse occurred. Unlike the stake or the wheel, this torment did not rely on complex tools or technical skill, but on the force of gravity and accumulated weight. Its simplicity made it extremely versatile, suitable for improvised punishments in rural contexts and for formal executions in cities with a legal tradition. One of the best-known precedents was the peine forte et dure, an English law practice that gained notoriety from the 13th century onwards. Although initially it was not applied as a proper execution but as a method of coercion to force defendants to testify, over time it became a form of slow and deliberate death. The prisoner was laid on the ground and heavy planks were placed on his chest. At first, the weight was not enough to kill him, but it did make breathing difficult. Over time, more stones or iron bars were added until the body gave way. The final result could take hours or even days, depending on the accused's resistance. In the peine forte et dure, the accused's silence was interpreted as a direct challenge to judicial authority. Dying crushed then became an involuntary statement. One who preferred the mortal weight rather than utter a single word was seen as someone whose will had to be broken to the end. This punishment symbolized the state's pressure on the individual, literally and figuratively. It was no coincidence that it was used only when the accused refused to testify. Death, in this case, was the result of their obstinacy, at least according to the logic of medieval courts. Outside England, crushing took different forms. In some regions of France, Germany, and Bohemia, it was used as punishment for repeat thieves, counterfeiters, and members of violent gangs. The condemned was placed in a shallow pit or on the cobblestones of a square, and then large stones were added on his torso, legs, and arms. The public actively participated, carrying additional stones or, at times, insulting the prisoner while the weight gradually immobilized him. The spectacle evoked a sense of collective justice, where villagers symbolically contributed to maintaining order. In certain religious contexts, especially within rural Christian communities, crushing was used against those considered to have dishonored shared morality. Chronicles mention that women accused of adultery, infanticide, or practices deemed impure could be punished by the accumulation of stones until death. In some cases, an attempt was made to maintain a degree of anonymity or decency by partially covering the body with cloth before placing the weights. However, the final effect was equally destructive. The pressure prevented breathing, broke ribs, and compressed vital organs until death ensued. An extreme variant of crushing is recorded in Italy and the Holy Roman Empire, the use of inclined planks. The condemned was placed under a large beam or plank supported at one end on a raised point. At the other end, executioners or assistants gradually added weight, causing the plank to descend onto the body. This technique had a notable theatrical component. The slow descent of the plank allowed observers to watch the condemned struggle to breathe, push, or move, though unsuccessfully. Occasionally, the executioner could pause the process to read aloud the crimes of the accused before continuing with the increasing pressure. Crushing did not produce visible blood or open wounds on the surface. This differentiated it from other spectacular punishments and made it a form of silent torment, where the audience had to imagine rather than see the internal destruction of the body. The absence of blood did not reduce the brutality. Organs were compressed, lungs collapsed, and facial veins swelled until they turned purple. The condemned's silence, or the intermittent sounds of final breaths, created an atmosphere of tension that reinforced the seriousness of the crime. In some cases, crushing was used as immediate punishment after a summary trial, especially in contexts of war or political crisis. During peasant uprisings and communal conflicts, rebel leaders could be subjected to the weight of stones as a symbolic act, showing the authorities' power over the rebellious masses. In this way, the torment also became a political theatre, where the weight applied to the condemned's body represented the weight of restored social order. The symbolism of crushing had multiple layers. On one hand, it represented the oppressive force of the state, the church, or the community over the transgressing individual. On the other, it evoked the idea that sin or crime weighed on society and had to be returned to the offender in physical form. This moral sense was deeply rooted in the medieval mindset, where it was believed that punishment had to correspond more or less literally to the nature of the crime. Stoning. Stoning was one of humanity's oldest methods of execution, and in the Middle Ages it persisted as a punishment loaded with communal symbolism. Unlike mechanical tortures or torments controlled by specialized executioners, stoning involved the entire community in the act of killing. This feature made it a particularly powerful instrument for reinforcing social, religious, and moral norms. Dying by stoning did not only mean being executed, but being repudiated by the group to which one belonged. Its medieval use is recorded in regions of Western Europe, in certain Germanic territories, and in areas under biblical or Islamic influence. Although the Catholic Church tried to prohibit it in several councils, stoning survived in rural, municipal, or semi-autonomous contexts where central authority had less control. Decisions could arise from local assemblies, summary trials, or in some cases, lynchings legitimized by ancient customs. The process began with the public identification of the crime. Most stonings were associated with behaviors considered deeply dishonorable: adultery, sacrilege, blasphemy, witchcraft, infanticide, and certain sexual crimes. In small communities where reputation was a fundamental pillar of social order, these offenses were perceived as a direct attack on the collective. The punishment, therefore, had to be carried out also by the collective. The condemned was taken to the center of the village, sometimes covered with a cloak or sack to increase humiliation. Sometimes they were placed against a wall or in a shallow pit. At other times, simply left standing or kneeling in the middle of a circle formed by the inhabitants. The choice of space responded to the need for visibility. Stoning was a public act, loaded with pedagogical meaning. The community surrounded the condemned with stones of different sizes. Huge rocks were not used, but medium or small stones that allowed a prolonged punishment. The goal was not a quick death, but a gradual process where each impact represented the moral disapproval of those participating. The violence was shared, distributed among many, which diluted individual responsibility. This psychological element helped justify the act. No one killed alone, everyone punished together. The first stones were usually aimed at the torso and limbs, avoiding the head. In this way, suffering was prolonged and everyone present had the opportunity to participate. The cries of the condemned competed with the murmurs of the crowd, and at times with prayers, songs, or invocations to reinforce the legitimacy of the punishment. The stones struck with an irregular cadence, reflecting the emotional intensity of the community in each execution. In some regions under Islamic influence, especially on the Iberian Peninsula during the early Middle Ages, stoning followed more regulated procedures. According to certain legal texts, it had to begin with the formal participation of the judge or the main members of the community who threw the first stones to mark the legitimate start of the act. Although the Christian kingdoms of the peninsula tended to abandon stoning as a formal punishment, in some rural territories it persisted as a marginal practice in cases of adultery or witchcraft. In Central Europe, especially in the Alps and Slavic regions, stoning acquired a ritual character associated with defending communal order. It was often carried out in places already marked as spaces of punishment, and the corpse, once dead, could remain exposed for hours or days as a visual warning. Death by stoning varied according to the intensity of the punishment. It could occur due to multiple traumas, blood loss, internal fractures, or the final blow, which was usually aimed at the head when the condemned could no longer remain conscious. In some cases, if the agony lasted too long, one of the men present was responsible for throwing a large stone to hasten the outcome. This final blow was not considered a merciful action, but a natural part of the process. The social function of stoning was evident: to restore collective order through the violent expulsion of the element considered dangerous or impure. By participating in the execution, members of the community reinforced their common identity and reaffirmed the norms that guided them. It was an act of internal cohesion as much as of punishment. Stoning also served as a mechanism of control over social behavior, especially in areas where judicial institutions were weak or non-existent. The fear of being stoned acted as a deterrent for crimes related to sexual morality, community betrayal, or the violation of deeply rooted taboos. The threat of punishment executed by one's own neighbors carried a psychological weight very different from a sentence imposed by a distant judge. The live burial. Live burial was one of the most terrible and silent punishments of the Middle Ages, a method that did not seek the bloody spectacle or the theatricality of the public square, but the disappearance of the condemned beneath the earth. Its intimate, dark, and definitive nature made it a punishment associated with shame, moral betrayal, and, in many territories, gender-related crimes. While methods such as the wheel or the stake were openly applied to reinforce social order through the display of the punished body, live burial acted as their opposite, a hidden punishment that physically erased the offender and returned them to the earth as if they had never existed. Although there are records of men executed by burial, the practice was especially linked to women accused of adultery, infanticide, false accusation, marital betrayal, or crimes considered unworthy within the medieval patriarchal order. The logic behind this choice was deeply symbolic. The earth that gave life became the element that took it away, closing over a body considered impure or dishonorable. The process began with a trial that, in many cases, did not require conclusive evidence. In rural territories of the Holy Roman Empire, for example, strong suspicions or partial testimonies were enough to issue a sentence. Once considered guilty, the woman was taken to a secluded place: forests, pits near walls, cemeteries, or spaces on the outskirts of the community. The execution did not require a complex scaffold. A pre-dug grave was sufficient. The victim was placed in the hole, sometimes naked, other times with a simple shroud. In some cases, she was tied by hands and feet to prevent any attempt to escape. Then began the cruelest part of the punishment: the earth. Executioners or community members threw shovels of soil onto the victim's body while she was still breathing. The earth fell slowly over the torso, legs, and face. Unlike other methods of execution, where the visual impact was immediate, here death was gradual, suffocating. The condemned could scream, beg for mercy, or try to free themselves, but the grave closed layer by layer until breathing became impossible. In some Germanic regions, live burial took on a variant known as the grave of shame, intended for women accused of adultery or marital betrayal. These pits were dug to a shallow depth, allowing the upper torso to remain exposed. The woman was buried up to the neck and left there for hours or even days, without food or water, exposed to public mockery, animals, and the elements. Death could occur from dehydration, cold, or injuries caused by the crowd. In this case, the execution combined public humiliation with lethal abandonment. In France, Flanders, and some areas of Italy, more ritualized variants of live burial existed. Authorities dug a hole outside the village where the condemned was placed inside an open wooden coffin. Soil was then thrown until the body was completely covered. This method, although faster, maintained the central principle of the punishment, the sense of closure, suffocation, and absolute darkness. Some sources also mention the use of live burial as a punishment for nuns who broke solemn vows or for women accused of witchcraft before the stake became the dominant method. In these cases, the execution had a penitential aspect. The earth was meant to symbolically purify the offense, as if the return to the soil were a forced confession. The symbolism of live burial was profound and not limited to the physical act. Burying someone alive erased their social presence, denied their existence, and prevented their body from becoming a symbol of resistance or an object of veneration. In a world where the grave and the corpse had a strong spiritual component, depriving the victim of a dignified burial meant prolonging their punishment beyond death. Their soul, it was said in some regions, would remain restless for having been returned to the earth without rituals. In certain medieval notarial documents, especially from the 14th century, it is detailed how live burials could be carried out by specific members of the victim's family. In cases of infanticide, for example, the child's father would throw the first shovel of earth, symbolizing that justice was executed not only in the name of the state or church, but also in the name of the clan or blood. These executions reinforced the idea that the community had an active role in maintaining its moral purity. The boiling cauldron. The boiling cauldron was one of the most horrifying methods of execution in the Middle Ages, a torture reserved for crimes that authorities considered particularly repulsive: coin forgery, poisoning, sacrilegious theft, domestic treason, and crimes marked by perfidy. Although regional variations existed, the essence of the punishment was always the same: immersing the condemned in a boiling liquid, which could be oil, water, wine, and even molten lead in some territories, until a painful, slow, and profoundly instructive death occurred for those witnessing it. The procedure began with the preparation of the cauldron, a huge metal container placed over an intense fire. In many cities, especially in France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, these cauldrons were part of municipal equipment, guarded by executioners or city marshals. They were used in public executions, generally in squares or markets, where the visibility of the punishment reinforced its exemplary character. The liquid used varied according to availability and symbolism. Boiling oil was especially feared because it reached temperatures above 150 degrees and caused deep and rapid burns. Water, more accessible, required a constant fire to remain boiling throughout the execution. Pitch or resin added a sticky component that accelerated the destruction of skin and tissues. In some cases, when an especially severe punishment was sought, molten lead was used, although this variant belonged more to royal executions or sentences applied to high-profile figures. Once the cauldron was ready, the condemned was led to the scaffold. The scene was carefully choreographed. The crowd gathered while the executioner checked the temperature of the liquid with an iron rod. Sometimes, to increase tension, the condemned's crime was publicly announced, emphasizing its vileness. Unlike other methods that required some skill or precision, the boiling cauldron left no room for error. In its brutality, it was a sure punishment. The condemned could be immersed in different ways. The most common method consisted of tying them with chains or ropes to a hook or elevated structure and slowly lowering them into the boiling liquid. The initial contact produced an immediate scream, followed by an instinctive reaction to escape, although the prisoner was completely immobilized. As the body descended, the burns became deeper, affecting muscles, nerves, and internal organs. The skin peeled off in layers, while steam rose, forming a thick cloud around the cauldron. In other regions, especially in northern Italy and some Baltic kingdoms, there was a variant of immersing only the limbs or specific parts of the body as a form of preliminary torture. The feet, hands, or arms could be scalded before proceeding to the full execution. This method prolonged the torment and served to obtain confessions or further humiliate the accused before their final death. In England, the use of the boiling cauldron gained notoriety during the reign of Henry VIII, when it was applied to cases of poisoning considered a direct threat to domestic order. The most famous example was Richard Roos, a cook accused of murdering his master with poison. His execution in 1531 followed a procedure with clear medieval roots. He was boiled alive in a large cauldron of water inside Westminster Palace, in the presence of a crowd specifically summoned to witness the torture. The symbolism of the boiling cauldron was multiple. First, the burning liquid represented extreme purification. The criminal's skin and flesh were destroyed by heat, as if the impure body were corrected by liquid fire. Second, the pot itself, an everyday object associated with cooking, home, and nourishment, was transformed into an instrument of justice. This symbolic inversion added a moral nuance to the punishment. He who had corrupted domestic order died in a domestic utensil. In certain places of the Holy Roman Empire, an additional element was added to the ritual. The condemned was forced to watch the cauldron while it boiled, hearing the bubbling and feeling the growing heat even before being immersed. This psychological prelude intensified the effect of the execution and reinforced the intimidating message to the audience. Death by boiling could take several minutes, depending on how quickly the body was submerged and the type of liquid used. Burns caused immediate shock, followed by circulatory collapse and organ failure. If the executioner lowered the prisoner slowly, the agony was prolonged, transforming the execution into an almost unbearable spectacle for those present. Some chronicles recount how the spectators recoiled at the steam or the smell of burning flesh, while others, closer to the scaffold, remained steadfast, motivated by the desire to witness the punishment of a criminal considered abominable. Suspension cages. Suspension cages, also known as hanging cages, cages gibbet, or simply gibbets in the Anglo-Saxon context, were one of the most characteristic methods of public punishment in the Middle Ages. Although they did not always constitute a method of direct execution, since in many cases the condemned had already died before being placed in the cage, their use as an instrument of prolonged agony, extreme humiliation, and permanent warning makes them one of the most recognizable elements of the medieval penal landscape. Their presence, suspended in plain view, served as a physical reminder of the fate awaiting those who defied the established order. The cages could vary greatly in shape and size. Some were small, designed to hold only the torso of the condemned, while others crudely mimicked the human form, with specific sections for arms and legs. Constructed of iron, sometimes reinforced with thick bars or chains, they were designed to immobilize the prisoner, preventing any significant movement. In certain cases, the structure was fitted so tightly to the body that the person had to remain standing or hunched over throughout their agony. The use of suspension cages had multiple purposes. First, they served as a deadly prison. The condemned was placed alive in the cage and then hoisted by pulleys or ropes to the top of a pole, tower, or specially selected tree. There, several meters above the ground, they were exposed to wind, rain, cold, heat, and the gaze of all. Death could take days, caused by dehydration, starvation, cold, or physical exhaustion. Second, the cages were used as a method of post-mortem display. Once executed by hanging, beheading, or garroting, the corpse was placed inside the cage to be publicly displayed for weeks or months. In England, the aforementioned gibbet was one of the most widespread instruments between the 14th and 16th centuries. Notorious criminals, such as repeat thieves, murderers, famous pirates, and political deserters or traitors, were exhibited in these hanging cages along main roads, bridges, or the outskirts of cities. This strategic placement aimed to create maximum psychological impact. Anyone arriving in the city immediately encountered the body of the punished as a constant and silent warning. The process followed a carefully established ritual. First, the body, whether alive or dead, was placed inside the cage. The bars were then secured with iron locks, and the structure was raised using thick ropes. Once suspended, the main rope was tied to a wooden arm or fixed structure, leaving it exposed to the elements. In some cases, the pole itself was constructed from sturdy materials to support the weight of the decomposing body for weeks. Suspension cages not only punished but also humiliated. For those who died inside them, the agony was slow and relentless. The condemned had to endure not only the lack of food and water but also constant attacks from scavenging birds. Crows, jackdaws, and other birds of prey slowly tore at the flesh exposed through the bars. This combination of hunger, exposure, and animals made the cage an insurmountable torment. When used to display corpses, the effect was different but equally brutal. The advanced decomposition of the body filled the air with a persistent stench, especially in summer. Visitors and local residents had to coexist with the sight and smell of the hanging body, reinforcing the lesson. Crime brought not only death, but also the eternal ruin of the offender's social memory. There would be no honorable grave nor symbolic rest. In Germany and parts of Central Europe, the cages acquired particularly elaborate forms. Some had mechanisms to rotate with the wind, causing the corpse to swing continuously, increasing the visibility of the punishment from afar. Others were placed on towers or walls, creating the impression that the city itself watched over and punished those who dared defy its laws. In certain cases, especially in Flanders and northern regions of France, the cages were used for crimes considered deeply dishonorable, such as church plundering, tomb desecration, or communal betrayal. The choice of this method was not solely motivated by a desire to kill or humiliate, but also by the intent to erase the condemned's reputation and deter imitators. While the body hung, it became a symbol of life's fragility before the law. The symbolism of suspension cages was multifaceted. They represented total authority over the punished body. In the case of corpses, the punishment extended beyond death. Justice controlled even how the body was displayed, observed, and remembered. Suspended between heaven and earth, the condemned was trapped in a moral limbo, unable to find peace even after death. The public played a key role. The cages were not intended for a limited audience, but for anyone passing by. They became part of the everyday landscape, a constant reminder of the power of the law. Travelers, merchants, pilgrims, and villagers saw the hanging body and absorbed the message. This fate awaited those who broke social cohesion.